In a quiet room, if you press your ear against a pillow, you can hear your heartbeat. As a 6-year-old boy, the muffled rhythmic beats sounded like soft footsteps on a carpeted floor. And so, as a kid, almost every night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I would hear these footsteps and I would be ripped back to consciousness, terrified. For my entire childhood, I lived with my mother in a fairly nice and extremely rural neighborhood that was in a transitional phase. People of lower economic means were gradually moving in. My mother and I were two of these people. Those that spend any amount of time driving on interstate highways will see half houses traveling alongside them. It's an odd sight if you let yourself think about it. Two halves of a house built somewhere miles away where it becomes a home. Everything about those structures has a feeling of impermanence. The wood that forms them is cut where it isn't used and assembled where it doesn't stay. The most permanent thing about those houses are the concrete support columns that they rest on, but even those seem transitionary in a way. My mother and I lived in one of these houses, but she took good care of it. As a kid, I always thought our house was quite nice. As I sit here and think about my old home and all the things in it, an amusing and pleasant conflict builds in my mind. I know that we were poor, but had you asked me then, I would have had no idea what could have prompted that question. My mother must have had so little money to spend, but I never remember her saying the words that tend to become the mantra of some parents when they try to subdue their children's eager shopping. We can't afford it. I don't remember wanting much. I even had a bunk bed despite being an only child. I'm sure this is the case for many children in low-income homes. But as a boy, despite the incongruity, I thought my home was as close to a palace as one could hope for. To me, the support columns under the house didn't represent what the house actually was, an imported structure on a makeshift foundation, but what it could be. I remember asking my mother if we could make the columns taller so our house would tower over all the others. Part of the love for the house stemmed from my general love for the area surrounding it. The neighborhood itself was relatively large in proportion to the town itself. Small towns lack many of the luxuries of larger towns or cities. What few stores there are close down early. Traveling events don't stop there because they probably missed your small dot on the map. And there aren't many police or hospitals at your disposal. But to a kid, these things don't matter because small towns often provide a luxury that can't be found in larger, more convenient or populated places: freedom. Of course, I had rules to follow. I had a lot of them, in fact. But I didn't notice any of them restricting me because I was allowed to do the one thing a kid in a relatively remote area likes to do: explore. Just a short walk from my back porch was a dense and untamed wilderness that I spent some part of nearly every day surveying. These woods and waterways surrounding the neighborhood were my playground during the day, but at night, as things often do in the mind of a child, they would take on a more sinister feeling. The apparent change in the very nature of the trees and the lake, I think, was mostly my fault. One of my mother's rules was that I could explore the woods on one condition: that I would be home before dark. To motivate my speedy return, I would play games in my mind when leaving the woods at dusk. My feet moved more quickly when I imagined that they were carrying me away from ghouls and beasts. When I would dream, the footsteps would belong to the pursuers. Sometimes I'd pretend that a hideous and ravenous wolf was charging through the woods just behind me. I'd imagine what would happen if I stumbled or fell and it caught up with me, but when I concentrated too hard on keeping my balance, it would always seem to ensure that I lost it. Other times, I convinced myself that there was an enormous clutter of spiders descending from the trees and blanketing the earth behind, and that I was always inches away from being ensnared in a collective web or simply overwhelmed by their numbers and tackled by the sheer weight of their individually weightless bodies. The thing I imagined most, I think, was that if I didn't make it home before the sun went down, my mother would be gone, that everyone would be gone, and that I'd be all alone. I always made it back home the quickest when I played that game. It didn't take long for these games to become a reflex, and the fear would appear without any effort at all. Some nights I would spill into the house so frantically that I would startle my mother, but this was the winter of the first grade of elementary school, so I tried to compose myself and I pretended that I was merely worried about getting home too late. The things I imagined in the woods just before nightfall created a feeling of general uneasiness in me when the sun retired. My home offered refuge from these terrors, but the architecture of my house came to sabotage my feelings of security. The concrete stilts that raised my house above the earth left a void just below the entirety of the floor of my home. Gradually, my mind came to fill this crawl space with imaginary monsters and inescapable scenarios, and they would consume my thoughts whenever I was awoken by the footsteps. I told my mom about these footsteps, and she said that I was just imagining things. This seemed an appropriate accusation, given my tactics for making curfew, but I persisted enough that she blasted my ears with water from a turkey baster once, just to place it at me, since I insisted that it would help. Of course it didn't. The footsteps continued that night, but I tried my best to ignore them, just like always. Despite the general eeriness that the games and footsteps would cast over the nighttime neighborhood, my life was a quiet one. I had adventures by myself, or more often with my best friend Josh, but I suppose every kid has their adventures. The only odd or noteworthy events that I can remember happening were the occasions when I would wake up on the bottom bunk, despite having gone to sleep on the top. This would only happen every now and again, but it really wasn't that strange since I'd sometimes get up to use the bathroom or get something to drink, and could remember just going back to sleep on the bottom bunk. This would happen frequently enough to remember, but infrequently enough to dismiss. In itself, waking up on the bottom bunk could never really bother me. I had heard footsteps, but was too far gone to be woken up by them. When I awoke, it wasn't from the sound of footsteps, but the feeling of biting cold and violent shivering. As I opened my eyes, the clashing of what I expected to see, what I had nearly always seen when I woke up in a place other than the top bunk, and what I actually saw, frustrated my senses as my mind tried to reconcile my expectations with actuality. I saw, or rather my mind showed me, the red cylindrical bars that supported the mattress of the top bunk, but beyond those, I saw stars. Gradually, the bars melted away and faded from my vision, and I was left with only those floating points of light and the jagged, crossing limbs of the tall trees that arched across them high up in the sky. I was in the woods. I shouldn't be here, I thought. The coupling of the woods with darkness was something I had trained myself to avoid. I sat up immediately. I tried to make sense of where I was. I thought I was dreaming, but that didn't seem right. Though neither did me being in the woods. My eyes were slowly adjusting to limited light, and gradually the trunks of trees and the shapes of overgrown bushes began to take form. I scanned over the foliage without really focusing on any of it as I searched for something I might recognize. Something that might give me some indication of where I was. An unnatural shape caught my eye, and I looked at it for what felt like a very long time until I could finally discern what it was. About 10 feet in front of me, resting among the mass of tangled sticks and loose leaves, there was a deflated pool float that was shaped like a shark. Even after I understood what it was, I continued looking at it, trying to figure out why it was there. This only added to the surreal feeling, to the point that I was sure that I must have been experiencing a dream rather than the world itself. After a while, though, it seemed like I just wasn't going to wake up because I wasn't asleep. I stood up to orient myself, and I caught the flash of some trampled shrubs that looked like a path. But the woods were thick behind it, so I turned to look elsewhere. I didn't recognize this place. I played in the woods by my house all the time, and so I knew them really well. But I had only been in them when it was dark once before. I had run through the woods straight to my house, at the last edge of dusk, countless times without even having to think about how to get there. But there's a big difference between dusk and dark. And as I stood there, taking in all that there was to see in the dim light, it started to creep into my mind much more forcefully that these might not be my woods after all. A shiver at that, I think, was only partially due to the chill that ran through me as I wondered how someone was supposed to find his way to a place when he didn't know where he was starting. I took a deep breath in a single step and felt a shooting pain in my foot. I lifted my leg quickly and reeled off balance, falling back to where I had woken up only moments ago. I moved my eyes from the terrain to my throbbing foot and saw what had felled me. I had stepped on a thorn. It stuck about an inch in the middle of my foot, but it only bled when I quickly tore it out of my skin. I wound my arm back to throw it someplace where it wouldn't pose any danger to me any longer, but as I searched for a safe spot, I realized that there wasn't one. By the light of the moon, I could see that the thorns were everywhere. The whole ground was laced with this natural barbed wire. I had been lucky to only step on a single thorn just then, but as this occurred to me, I became conscious of the rest of my body. I looked at my other foot, but it was fine. As a matter of fact, so was the rest of me. I searched over my legs and feet with my eyes and hands. No cuts, no scrapes. I didn't have any other scratch on me. I wasn't even that dirty. I cried for a little bit and then stood back up. I opened my mouth and filled my 6-year-old lungs to capacity. And just as I was about to scream for help, my breath hitched in my throat as a thought lodged itself powerfully into my mind. What if someone heard me? I held the air tightly in my chest and stood puzzled by my own question. I needed help. Shouldn't I hope that someone would hear me? All at once, I began to think of the friends and monsters that I had imagined stalking and chasing me through and out of what might be these woods. I found myself wishing I had never played those games. I let the air escape slowly to give myself a last chance to use it in case I changed my mind and wanted to yell. I didn't. I would have to find my own way. I didn't know which way to go, so I picked up a direction and began walking. I walked for what felt like hours. I tried to walk in a straight line, but there was no path to follow. I made sure to course correct when I had to take detours around tree limbs that were too entwined to move through, or patches of thorns that were too broad to step over. Every time I would make my way past one of these natural obstacles, I would be confronted with a seemingly identical tapestry of foliage, and the feeling of hopelessness would begin to assert itself a little more. I just wanted to see something familiar, and each time the woods appeared particularly thick, I thought I had found my landmark. Marking the outer edge of my usual exploration, there was an enormous pile of discarded and decaying Christmas trees that my best friend Josh had found during a game of hide-and-seek. Although he had been driven out of its concealing shelter fairly quickly by fire ants, we would return to it many times to trample on the stray and spherical colored ornaments that had been left behind. We had many stories about where the trees had all come from, but I assume now that the genesis of the pile is much more ordinary than what we had hypothesized. Whatever the origins, what was left was a tangled mass of decorated, however sparsely, holiday trees that looked, from a distance, to be a single colossus Christmas tree. This would be the easiest thing to spot in my woods, and if I found it, I would know where I was. But that was only if these were my woods. As I stepped delicately through the brush, an idea began to form in my mind. If I could climb the tree, I might be able to see my way to the wood's exit. I became less dependent and began searching for a canopy for a proper scouting position. None of these trees seemed tall enough, but if I could find one that was, I might even be able to see my house, I thought. I stood still and balanced carefully over my now aching feet. The trees that loomed over me when I had woken up in these woods had been tall, I recalled, but I struggled to remember just how tall they were. What about the branches? I mumbled to myself. I remembered seeing branches above me, and if they grew low enough, I knew that I would be able to climb up the tree. If I could find my way back to the spot, I could work my way up the tree and possibly see a way out. But that would mean going back. I shifted my feet and tried to make the best decision, turning around. I took a few steps back toward the direction which I had come, and I froze as a phrase echoed in my head. How far can you go into the woods? I hadn't been tortured by this question for well over a year, and I stood there a bit bewildered by the fact that it had suddenly come rushing back into my mind. On an afternoon towards the beginning of kindergarten, I had come home from exploring a part of the woods that I had never seen before. I was excited to tell my mother how far I had gone, and she seemed, even if she was only humoring me, to be equally excited to hear it. When I had finished describing my journey, she congratulated me and asked if I thought I had finally seen all the woods there were in the neighborhood. I told her that I didn't think so, but that I wanted to. She smiled as she asked, "So how far can you go into the woods?" This sounded like a challenge, and so I answered confidently, but none of my answers seemed to satisfy her. Really far, super far, and even all the way were all rejected as viable responses. After each attempt to close the issue, she would just return with the same question, becoming more amused by the minute. At a loss and wanting to be able to answer her question so that she would stop asking it, I asked the only authority figure I knew, my teacher. She gave me a quizzical look and asked me what I meant. I didn't even really know what I meant, and so I just repeated the question. She thought for a moment and said, "I don't know, let's see," as she walked me over to the map that was tacked to our classroom wall. She asked me the name of the street, which I had memorized, and she took a moment to find it, before touching my shoulder and holding her finger to a big patch of green. "I think these are your woods," she said. I repeated my question yet again. I told her that my mom had been asking me this question repeatedly. As I told my teacher this, she seemed to realize something and took her finger off the map. She smiled coyly, saying, "I don't know. How far can you go into the woods?" As I stood there in the woods with my arms tucked inside my shirt to avoid the frigid air, I thought about this question and remembered how I came across the answer. This stirred a warm fondness in me that almost made me forget about the reason that question had come back into my mind to begin with. I discovered the answer just a few weeks after I asked my teacher. My grandparents called to chat with my mother and me, and when my mom handed me the phone to talk to my grandfather, Pop, I thought I could have a little fun and be on the giving end of the antagonizing for once. Before he could even ask how I'd been, I charged at him. "Hi, Pop. How far can you go into the woods?" "What? How far can you go into the woods?" I repeated knowingly, although I knew nothing at all. "Oh, well, I suppose about halfway," he said, snickering. What? How come you could only go halfway? And then, as if he had been waiting for this moment for his entire life, he bellowed, "Because if I went any farther, I'd be coming out." He began laughing so hard that it transformed into a coughing fit, and he handed the phone off to my grandmother. It took me a while to appreciate the nature of the question and its answer. I had never heard a riddle before, but the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. I would ask the question to dozens of people in the months to follow. Standing there barefoot in the woods thinking about this riddle, I found that it wasn't amusing anymore. However, now, it was more than just a silly question. I had walked a long way. For all I knew, I couldn't walk any farther in. Last tree might be just ahead. If I turned back now, I might be walking back into the woods rather than out of them. I pivoted where I stood and resumed the trajectory that I had adopted when I set out. Everything was eerily quiet as I pressed on. The only noticeable sounds were of crickets, cicadas, and light grinding of leaves under my sore feet. Occasionally, however, I would step too hard on a healthy stick, and its cracking would drive the noisy creatures to silence. I would stand there paralyzed by the sudden hush, and I would hold my breath and listen for sounds I hoped not to hear. When the insects resumed, so would I. Desperate to keep their noise, I trod carefully on the undergrowth, but it was thick, and here and there my foot would press down on a stick just enough to snap it. The bugs would arrest, and so would I. This relationship persisted until the last interlude that I remember. I broke a stick, the insects hushed themselves, but instead of the expected silence, I heard what sounded like an infant crying in the distance. I could feel the blood draining out of my limbs as I listened to this wailing that didn't sound as far in the distance as I wished it to be. I felt a churning in my stomach and a weakness in my legs. Standing completely still, being careful not to make any noise, I waited. But the sound didn't stop. Suddenly another sound joined the chorus. A large stick snapped just behind me. I panicked. I think now, as an adult, the sound I heard that night was a cat in either heat or rage. But I had no thoughts in my mind as I ran veering in different directions, taking as much care as I could to avoid the big thickets of bushes and collapsed trees. I was paying close attention to where I stepped because my feet were in such bad shape, and I suppose I instinctively wagered that it would be better to move less quickly than not at all. I paid too much attention to where I was stepping and not enough attention to where those steps were leading, because not long after hearing the cry, I saw something that filled me with such despair that I find it difficult to articulate its potency even now. It was the pool float. I was right back where I had woken up. I stood there dazed, staring at the pool float. It looked oddly familiar to me now that the initial mental haze that had plagued me when I first awoke had dissipated. I wondered if that was because it was the only thing in the woods that I actually recognized, but that didn't seem quite right. I shook it off and attended to what really mattered. I traveled for what felt like a great distance, but I hadn't really moved at all. This wasn't magic or some supernatural folding of space. I was lost, utterly and completely. Up until that moment, perhaps in an effort to focus on what I could control, I had thought more about getting out of the woods than how I got in. But being back at the beginning caused my mind to swim. My feet had not hurt at first, but they were agonized now, and I had made not even an inch of progress. I had been hoping that these were my woods. From the time that I had awoken in them, I had hoped that I simply didn't recognize them due to the obscuring, distorting darkness. But my optimism had long since disappeared, swallowed like everything else by the engulfing blackness. Had I run in a huge circle around that spot? Or did I just get turned around and start making my way back? I realized that even if I set out again on the path I had tried to follow at the outset, there was no way to be sure I would actually chart the same course. And if I took a completely different course, then I wouldn't have even made progress in terms of scouting the area through my original excursion. And although I had pushed it to the very back of my mind, rhythmically like a metronome, my mother's riddle marched back to the front lines, its footsteps faint at first, but gradually building in a crescendo that became so loud I could think of nothing else. Into the woods. As this echoed through my thoughts, I suddenly pictured the woods as a vast circle of trees. As I turned on the spot which I stood and looked around me, a fear crept into my mind that I might be standing at the very edge of a circle, and that whatever direction I picked would just lead me deeper, farther into the woods. As I continued scanning the landscape around me, my eyes fixated on one of the trees that I had seen towering above me when I first woke up. I looked at it dully, the way you gaze at something when you aren't actually seeing it, despite how unshakably fixed your eyes have become, like staring at a wall when you are lost in thought. Slowly both my eyes and mind regained their focus, and I moved my head up. It was tall. I forced the despair out of myself and made my way back to the tree, being careful to avoid the thorns that were blanketing the ground. As I stood on the exposed roots of the tree and looked straight up the height of its trunk, I thought that the tree must surely be tall enough to allow me to see my way out. I reached my hand up and grasped the lowest limb, but as I tightened my grip, my arm began shaking. Trying to steady myself, I moved my other hand up onto the branch, but when I tried to pull myself up, I felt my body protest. I remember thinking that night that it was simply too cold to climb the tree, but I know it wasn't the cold that stopped me, it was fear. I released the branch and looked back to the spot where my night had started. I could still see the place where I had woken up. It was a relatively clear spot, in the middle of an otherwise debris-laced ground, as if I had tried to make a snow angel in the dirt, and had given up in the middle of the project. It was a strange sight, but not any stranger than the rest of the place. Fully conscious of my feet's condition, I walked back to the small clearing and sat down with my legs crossed. What if there's no way out? I questioned tortuously. I was too defeated to feel anything but apathy, and I turned my attention back to the tall tree and the stars above, looking upon them with listlessness. Tracing my eyes over the stars, I had an epiphany. I heard so much about explorers navigating the woods by sea, traveling to undiscovered lands and building new civilizations. I had learned that they could do this by following the stars, and my spirits rose in a flash as I realized that I might be able to do the same. At the time, I thought the North Star was just the brightest star, and so I looked for and found the one which was the most brilliant shimmer. I followed it. I was careful to keep the star that I picked in my sights at all times. If I reached a point where the trees above obscured it too much or for too long, I redirected myself on the path that avoided them. I ignored every sound that tempted me to whip my body around to confront it, and despite the pain, I surveyed the ground primarily by the feel of my feet rather than the sight of my eyes, knowing that if the star were lost, so too would be my way. Eventually my surroundings began to look more familiar. A network of fallen trees that I recognized as ones that I had used as balance beams offered my first legitimate sign of hope. Though I walked around and not across them this time. Soon after, I came upon the Christmas tree pile, its scattered ornaments glimmering dimly in the weak moonlight. I gave it a wide berth to avoid the glass shards that might still pepper the ground from times that my feet when they were less vulnerable, had pressed down upon the glass balls of holiday flair and crushed them. My nerves were beginning to calm, and when I saw a dirt void called the ditch, I knew that I had made it out. The feeling of relief that washed over me brought with it a smile that was more sincere and joyful than any I had ever worn on my face before. Despite the impulse to quicken my pace when I had my bearings restored, and no longer had to watch my North Star so vigilantly, my feet were in so much pain that I had to be mindful of each step. A distance I had covered in mere seconds, and my nightly exodus from these woods seemed to be nerve-ending. I walked with a limp in both legs, in an attempt to avoid putting too much weight on either foot, but when I saw the edge of the woods, dirt floor cut off by the paved cul-de-sac of my street, I grew so happy to be so close to home that I broke into a light jog, despite how much it hurt. When I actually saw the roof of my house over a lower-set neighboring house, I let out a light sob and ran faster, wincing with each step. I just wanted to be home. I had already decided that I wouldn't say anything about any of this to my mother because I had no idea what I could possibly say. I would get back inside somehow, clean up, and get in bed. She would never even have to know about my odyssey. Anything that I might say would seem preposterous, and the thought of this whole experience reaching its end strengthened my resolve to leave it in the past forever, once I finally shut that door behind me. However, my heart sank as I rounded the corner and my home came fully into view. Every light in the house was on. I knew my mom was awake, and I knew I would have to explain, or at least try to explain, where I had been. And I couldn't figure out where to start. My run became a jog, which became a walk. I ducked under the lowest branch of a large pine tree that stood outside our property, and carefully lifted the middle latch to the gate on the chain-link fence that enclosed our backyard. Slowly, I pushed open the gate in an effort to quiet the squeaking hinges. In about 15 seconds, I would knock on my back door and attempt to explain myself, but I was still reflexively trying to avoid being caught. I saw my mother's silhouette through the blinds, and although I was worried about how to explain things to her, it suddenly didn't matter to me anymore. I was home. It was over. I walked up the couple of steps to the porch and put my hand on the doorknob. I turned it thinking that it might be unlocked since my mother was awake. There was no sense in delaying the inevitable. There was no reason to knock. It turned full motion, and I felt a mixture of both relief and apprehension. I was just about to push the door open when two arms wrapped around me and pulled me back, away from the door. This couldn't be happening. I had evaded and outrun my imaginary pursuers countless times in my nightly scramble from the woods, but this wasn't imaginary. I looked at the silhouette in the window and tried to reach out. The arms constricted around my chest and lifted me off the ground while I struggled against them. I looked down at the appendages that ensnared me. They were small, but there was something covering them. It looked like fur. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut. This can't be happening, my mind roared. The monsters would just pretend. I opened my eyes again and looked at the arms that were crossed over my torso. It was fabric, not fur, but this brought no real comfort. I was still being restrained. It still needed to get free. I screamed as loudly as I could, "Mom! Help me! Please, Mom!" The feeling of being so close to safety, only to be physically pulled away from it, filled me with some kind of dread that is, even after all these years, indescribable. The door that I had been torn away from opened, and a flash of hope shot through my heart. But it wasn't my mom. It was a man, and he was enormous. I thrashed violently and kicked at the shins of the person holding me. But even if I had succeeded in escaping my captor, I knew that I would also have to get away from the person who had just came out of my house, this hulking figure who was now steadily approaching me. He reached his hand out for me, and it extended out the shadow that had been cast on him by the porch light just above his head. It was a cruelly cracked claw, badly burned with the consistency of a plastic bag that had melted and cooled. Until that moment, I had never imagined that I could be in any legitimate danger from which my mother could not rescue me. But as I watched the man close the distance between us, and as I felt my captor's grip grow even tighter, my fear was joined with rage. My mother simply cannot be gone. Let me go! Where is she? Where is my mom? What did you do to her? As my throat stung from screaming, and I was drawing in another breath, I became aware of the sound that had been persistent for longer than I had perceived it. Honey, please calm down, I've got you! It sounded like my mom. The arms loosened and set me down, and as the man who had been approaching me leaned down and put his hand on my shoulder, he eclipsed the porch light with his head, allowing me to see more than just his frame. He was a large man with a tremendous burn scar on his left arm. I broke my eyes away from it and moved them up to his badge. He was a police officer. I turned to face the voice behind me with hope that was still tempered by fear. It really was my mom. The dark brown curls of her hair brushed my face as she knelt down to embrace me. I was finally safe. Tears started flowing down my face, and I sobbed heavily, while the three of us went inside. The back door opened to a narrow hallway. On the right was a door that opened to the bathroom, which was connected to my room, via another door. There was a faint smell of mildew that emanated from the bathroom. Nightmares of villains and ghouls that hid in my bathroom meant that I would never draw the curtains closed when I wasn't in the shower, and would only draw it closed when I was. Because of this, water collected in its folds and filled the whole area of the house with a faint smell of watery rot. To the left of our washing machine and dryer, my cat was sitting on top of the dryer, and I gave him an absent stroke as I walked past and turned left towards the dining room. We sat at the table that my mother and I used as a dining area, and we ate in a workstation when I had school projects. It was a fairly large square table that had been painted white, but there were several spots where daily use had started to chip the white paint away, revealing layers of different colors on top of the original coat. One area looked almost like a cross-section of a Jawbreaker candy, with its concentric and rainbow-colored rings. Though my idle or nervous hands had helped along that more excavated section wherever I sat at the table to do homework, or have a serious talk with my mother, historically, the more nervous I was, the more frantically I dug. I learned that night that the first coat of paint was yellow. I'm so glad you're home, sweetie. I was worried I'd never see you again. She had begun to cry as well. Where did you go? I don't know. I don't know what happened. My fear of the whole event being ineffable was coming true. What do you mean you don't know what happened? Where have you been? Oh, look at you, you're filthy. She surveyed me now that we were in better light. Oh God, your feet! I looked down and winced. The tops of my feet were caked in a thick dark coat of my own blood that had already begun to crack with the pattern of damaged glass. As I moved my feet against the linoleum, I could feel that the blood was acting as an adhesive, and I could hear the sound of my skin peeling free from the floor as I looked at them. You went to the woods? Baby, we've talked about this. I can't believe you. Mom, I didn't. I don't know what happened. I protested. This was quickly becoming an argument, and neither my mother nor I was feeling up to it. It's okay. It's fine, honey. Just don't ever do this again, okay? I'm not sure me or my shins could take it. A little laughter broke through my sobs, and I smiled a bit. Well, I'm sorry for kicking you, but why'd you have to grab me like that? I was just afraid you'd run away again. You had just come home. I wasn't about to let you run off again after what you wrote. I was confused. What do you mean? We found the note you left on your pillow, she said, and pointed the piece of paper that the police officer was sliding across the table. I picked up the note and started reading it as my mother and the police officer walked into the kitchen. The note said that I was unhappy, that I never wanted to see her or any of my friends again. It was a running away letter. While the policeman exchanged a few words with my mom, I started the letter. I didn't remember writing any letter. I didn't remember anything about this. But there were many times when I would do things at night that I couldn't recall. I kept reading the letter as I thought about how I would sometimes use the bathroom without remembering getting up, or I would wake up and be so tired that I didn't remember the ride to school. But this was different. This was wrong. Even if I sometimes went to the bathroom at night and didn't remember, or even I could have gone into the woods on my own and gotten lost. Even if all these things were true, one thought repeated endlessly in the background of all the other questions and doubts that filled my mind. This isn't how you spell my name. I didn't write this letter.